Nobody knows for sure when the first people arrived in what is now Wisconsin. At that time, no one kept track of dates, and worse yet, there was no written language. Probably these people were nomadic hunters who followed the animal herds. And when the elephant-like mammoths and mastodons went north behind the melting glaciers, the hunters tagged along behind. And then over the years, the tusks, the teeth, the bones of these big animals have been dug up at various places around the state. But the skeletons of the first people are very seldom, if ever, found. We do know some things about them. For example, they had 7 different cultures or lifestyles in Wisconsin before the first whites came. A group called the Paleo-Indians were here about 9,000 years ago, and they lived here for a total of about 2,000 years. They didn't leave very much behind for us to study, however, probably because they didn't have much that would survive over time. The glaciers left some of our state free of ice, while the rest was scraped almost flat, and old living places were wiped out. One site that remains untouched deserves our focus. Once a year in the fall, interested people from all over have the chance to visit the hilltop in west central Wisconsin, which is called Silver Mound. Special because we have proof that the very first people to live in this state were here. They were the Paleo-Indians. Staff people from the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Center at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse are here to tell visitors what they and others have learned about this ancient stone quarry and the thousands of tools and weapon makers who came here to mine the precious rocks used in their everyday lives. Among the university archaeologists was Roland Rodell. He sat down with us between his guided tours to tell us more about this site.
Well, from the archaeological evidence, which is based on finding the remains of human activity, specifically for the earliest inhabitants, which would be various forms of stone projectile points, spear points, knives, and things like that. There is very strong evidence that people began to inhabit what is now Wisconsin right towards the end of the last ice age, approximately in a time period of maybe as far back as 12,000 years ago. We feel very certain at least 10,000 years ago and onwards, people were beginning to move into Wisconsin and exploit the various resources that were available to them.
Was it likely that these people came across the Bering Strait from Asia to eventually arrive in Wisconsin?
Yes, that's the most logical and feasible explanation, that the Bering Strait, or what was then a large landmass which connected both Siberia and Alaska, was a landmass that was about almost 1,000 miles wide, a tundra-type plain in which people from Asia, hunters, and most likely following game herds back and forth across the Bering Land Strait, eventually filtered in, these hunters eventually filtered in following game into what is now Alaska, and over a period of time worked their way down through several generations of people, worked their way down into what is now the contiguous United States and into Central America and into South America. There's a lot of evidence throughout many areas of Wisconsin and into Minnesota as well of the Paleo-Indian occupation. Mostly it comes from finding a certain style of projectile point or spear point. It's very distinguishable. It's not only the spear point is elongated, but on both sides of the spear point there is a channel, or what we call a flute. It would most likely facilitate hafting the point onto a wooden shaft, a spear shaft, or a dart shaft used with an atlatl, a throwing stick. These have been found in many areas throughout Wisconsin. Just recently in southeastern Wisconsin, there have been a couple of mammoth kills that have been discovered. Although they have not been directly associated with Paleo-Indians, the fact that mammoths died out at the end of the Ice Age, and the fact that these particular remains have cut marks on them made from stone tools, and also associated with them are some stone fragments of tools and the debris of resharpening tools strongly suggests that these creatures were killed by Paleo-Indians.
Visitors to Blue Mound regard this as a unique prehistoric site in Wisconsin. Archaeologist Rodell quite agrees.
Yes, it is in several respects. A lot of Paleo-Indian points, spear points, were made of this particular kind of rock, this silicified sandstone. It was a rock that apparently was prized because of the quality of the rock. You could make a very nice looking tool that kept a sharp edge, and it could be reworked and resharpened. So it was a material that was preferred by early hunters. Also, around the outcrop of this rock in the farm fields at lower elevations have been found a lot of spear points that date to the Paleo-Indian and a little bit more recent, the Archaic period as well as literally tons of the debris from resharpening and making these tools, and a variety of other tool types that we associate with these early hunters as well. And this big rock outcrop, which covers about probably between 80 to 100 acres in size, is known as Silver Mound. Exactly why it's called Silver Mound is not 100% clear. However, there are a couple of explanations. First of all, when white settlers came here, they believed that there may be silver within this geologic deposit, and began to exploit a number of locations on the mound itself to dig for silver. This may have been brought about by what we believe is, you can see through here, this is heavily forested today, but this is a rather young forest, and with the arrival of Europeans, most likely it was not nearly as heavily forested, that the rock was more barren and the area is more exposed. Due to periodic burning, either natural or by the Native Americans who used burning a lot to clear areas. So this exposure you see right here was probably much more common and could be seen, this and other exposures, from much greater distance, particularly when the sun was more oblique angle in the sky in the morning and in the late afternoon hours, shining on this. From a distance, the rock outcrop apparently glared, which led some people to even believe that, well, there's silver in them our hills. There is evidence, again, based on artifact styles that we identify with these particular periods, that people were periodically, over long periods of time, coming to Silver Mound and exploiting this rock. And with the woodland periods and the later Oneota period, we even find ceramics, pottery that we identify with these periods found in these locations around the site here. Matter of fact, that the best known archaeological site on the mound itself, the Dwyer Rock Shelter, was found woodland period pottery as well as Oneota pottery. There's not a lot of it, but it tells us that people were coming here to exploit this rock and using it. And then in reverse, on these Oneota sites, particularly many in the La Crosse area, we find a lot of the rock that could only have come from the Silver Mound area and one other outcrop, which is around Arcadia, Wisconsin. So by looking at this kind of evidence, the material evidence, we make these connections, not only to the cultural connections, but the time period connections as well.
How widely distributed were artifacts from this mining operation here?
The artifacts, as well as just the raw material itself, not always were finished artifacts traded, but material was quarried out, and that was transported to places where tool production would take place. It's been found as far south as Mammoth Cave area in Kentucky, into Illinois, Missouri, and Minnesota, in these general areas. So it has a very wide distribution.
It's believed the early Wisconsin people used a peculiar hunting weapon called an atlatl, or spear thrower.
Okay. And prior to the bow and arrow coming in, this was the major hunting tool. Okay. What this did was this was an extension of your arm. Like that. And when this hit the animal, this stayed in, and this fell off. So what you had to do was carry a number of these small foreshafts with you, and not a bunch of big spears.
The difficult thing is you have to maintain back pressure so it doesn't come off the nock.
At Blue Mounds, the people were given a chance to try out the spear thrower, or atlatl. It wasn't easy, and there weren't many successes.
He feels that these natives 12,000 years ago understood physics enough to realize how this would work. He does take one more.
A type of tool is very successful for hunting. It was used for a long period of time in the Americas. The use of the bow and arrow does not enter North America until sometime probably very early on, about a little over 1,000 years ago in the subarctic. It was believed it was introduced by Eskimos in the Americas, and over a long period of time, the technology of the bow and arrow filtered down into what is now the contiguous United States. Use of the bow and arrow, and this is just basically an educated guess, doesn't arrive into the general Wisconsin area till about maybe 600 AD, 700 AD. And we believe that the bow and arrow probably quite rapidly replaced the use of the atlatl or throwing stick. Its advantages, the bow and arrow over the atlatl and throwing stick, particularly in heavily wooded areas, is that a person using a bow and arrow does not need a lot of, in a sense, elbow room to shoot his projectile, just enough room to stretch the bowstring. Whereas in the atlatl, one needs to really wind back their arm extension and take a couple of good steps to get a good velocity behind it. So we think that when the bow and arrow was introduced, it rapidly replaced the use of the atlatl.
Arrowheads are found at Silver Mound and all over the state, but the shafts they were attached to did not survive over time. A Viroqua, Wisconsin man, Lauren Cade, is doing research on ancient bows and arrows.
Well, I have a hunting blunt that would be used for hunting small game, probably. In fact, I have two different examples. One has a bulb on the end to give it a little weight. This would not penetrate game at all. It would be used just to stun the game. And this other one would have just a rounding point, probably used for target practice and also for hunting small game. This arrow here would probably be used for hunting large game. It has a stone tip. Tip is applied by winding sinew. The feathers are also put on by winding sinew. The sinew is dried, it becomes a very good holder of the feathers. The raw materials we use is called dogwood. We have what's called gray dogwood. When it's young shoots, the bark is actually a little bit green, but it's still considered gray dogwood. This other material is called red osier or red dogwood. Another raw material is called viburnum or downy arrowwood. And all of these materials, once they're harvested, are wrapped tightly to hold them as straight as possible in the beginning curing stage. After about 2 months of curing or drying, the bundles are broke apart and the bark removed, and then the wood is straightened over fire.
According to Gordon Peters, dugout canoes made by the state's first people have been found in Wisconsin, recovered from lake bottoms. Peters and assistants made such a primitive dugout with tools the ancient people, perhaps mostly the women, would have used.
Yeah, what we did is we used an adze to chop a small flat surface on the top of the log. And there was a little platform so we could build a small fire on it. Okay, we built the fire on there, and it burnt a shallow depression in there. From there, we continued to enlarge the size of the fire, eventually burning a shallow trench in the top of the log. Then, by taking this log and oriented into the wind, all you have to do is start a fire on the windward side of this thing, and within a short period of time, you've got a fire going the entire length of the log. Okay, we know that they are probably making dugout canoes during what we call the archaic period, which is a period from about 8,000 years ago, probably to about 2,500 years ago. Given the types of projectile points that we found up above, broken spear points, they come from the very late Paleo-Indian period, which around here would probably be 12,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. And also large spear points from the early archaic period. That's why I'm placing the occupation of the site up on top at the transition between the Paleo-Indian people and the archaic people, so that period right around 8,000 years ago.
An obvious question is, could there still be remains of more dugouts in Wisconsin lakes today?
Hard to say. There could be if you have the right sedimentation, the right silting. Of course, whether or not you ever find them, that's something else, because with 8,000 years of silting, if we find anything, it's going to be much more recent vintage than that. Even though water is a really good preservative for wood like this, and especially if it gets silted in, because you won't have the frosting and thawing action, things like that, that would be detrimental to wood. It would pretty much create kind of a microenvironment for it and preserve the wood material. Well, we know that about 2,500 years ago, the pine starts to diminish up here, and again is replaced because the climate is changing again to a wetter, cooler climate similar to what we have today. And we see birch coming in again, along with the spruce and the balsam. In other words, we're going back to kind of a boreal forest type ecosystem. So with the large birch coming in 2,500 years ago, I'd say that they probably stopped. Well, I don't know if they stopped making these, but you had a sufficient amount of birch up here then to move into something which is more, what do you want to say, technologically complex, such as a birch bark canoe.
The old copper culture that flourished for 2,000 years and ended 3,000 years ago was found mostly in northern Wisconsin, with much of the metal coming from Isle Royal out in Lake Superior. In a state park named for its puzzling prehistoric features created by humans, visitors and archaeologists all wonder why and how such earth-moving could ever have been done. Sadly, there still are no clues today. And if only we could have watched while the ancient people of what is called Aztalan in Jefferson County built their fortresses of tall poles and erected immense Aztec-like mounds. No doubt, the secrets of these first Wisconsin people will never be fully uncovered.